Ok.
I'm going to stop my camera. Good morning to everyone in Brazil. Good afternoon in Europe. Good evening to Fanish in Asia. He's about to join in. It's an enormous pleasure to moderate this event today. I'm grateful to all of you for becoming available to be here today. The purpose is to advance our knowledge of how to organize, to face big challenges. And the context is that we've chosen is Sao Paulo and how social movements have started over the last few decades to deal with the housing crisis in Sao Paulo. And the multiple movements have been very resilient collectively over the last several years. The city has developed a lot, although there's still quite a lot of work to be done. Before I introduce the speakers for first part and second part, I would like to thank, first of all, Rafael Valim, director of the IREE Institute, for hosting this event. So he's made the platform available from the Institute to allow the event to happen, without whom we would not be able to do this so easily. Of course, I'm also very grateful to all of you for your efforts and to ensuring that you are available intellectually and physically. The event is split into two parts. First part, there's a group of personalities from Brazil. Perhaps for those of you outside Brazil, their names are not as familiar, but in Brazil, their names are very well known. And sometimes also a little bit of controversy, which is part, obviously, of the work they are engaged in. The first panel looking at progress developed in Brazil to deal with the housing crisis in Brazil. We have Guilherme Boulos. He will open up. He's a politician in Brazil, leader of the homeless workers movements, 2 decades of activity in housing movements, fighting for the right to housing, and recently he announced he's applying for federal candidacy. This is not a political event. We are focused in trying to understand how we address the social problem, not only in Brazil, but in other parts of the world, but certainly in the global south, but also in the north area. The housing crisis, although it may appear in other ways. Afterwards, we'll have Carmen. She's an exceptional person. I was privileged to know her. She's from Bahia. She's got 8 children. She's leader of the MSTC movement, homeless movement in city center. She's managed to save 3,000 people around thereabouts out of precarious housing and help promote their well-being. In studying her profile, I found this. Without home, you are nothing. You can't open a bank account, can't send your CV, you can't buy a fridge, even paying portions. So this is a key summary of the problems that brings us here today. After Carmen, Nabil Bonduki, he's an academic, architect, a writer. He was also worked in the municipality in 2001, 2004, and later in 2006. And he was a key player in the housing planning for Sao Paulo. And for those who follow public life in Sao Paulo, Nabil is somebody who with so much to say about a lot of things and with a very coherent psyche and who has been accompanying the developments for many decades. We will conclude the morning, the first panel with Luciana Bebesche, whom I was privileged to interview recently, and I was impressed with her coherence of and the clarity of thinking in the issues. She's a solicitor, a lawyer, and she's key in the developments with organized occupations. She specializes in human rights, and interestingly, she reconciles her lawyer profile with a doctorate in planning and territorial management, which makes her an even more important player. After the break, I'll introduce the academic panel for the second part, who will contribute to the discussion. So I would hand on to Guilherme. Thank you, Guilherme, for having accepted the invitation. The floor is yours. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the invitation, for the compliment. Also, thank you for Rafael Bailin, who helps a friend, and greetings to all participants who are sharing this discussion table about Brazil. I would like to start this brief presentation mentioning, mainly for those who live outside Brazil, the seriousness, the gravity of the problem of housing in our country. If we look at data from 2018 by the Foundation Getúlio Vargas, we believe there's also a hiding of data, a boycott to census, with 7 million people needing housing in Brazil. So it's exponential development of the need for housing. Many of those who are participating here today, they live in this city with 12 million inhabitants in the city center, 20 million in metropolitan area. Official data shows that more than 31,000 people living on the streets. And we believe that data is underestimated. Who walks the streets of São Paulo can find real areas of refugees on the streets, on the pavements, with people living in tents. So the serious problem of housing has become even more serious since the economic crisis that started in 2016. The development of the laws that had developed with Lula presidency, like the program My House, My Life, which was in practice liquidated, completely finished with the Bolsonaro presidency. And then the unemployment has gone worse, the economy has gone worse at the moment when all the recommendations of the sanitary authorities in the world would be for people to be home during the pandemic. But the problem is many people didn't have a home to stay. So that made the very poor conditions of housing and sanitation turn Brazil faced a greater impact of the coronavirus. Having said that, it is important for us to understand the increased number of occupations by the social movements in the recent years. A series of empty buildings, whether it is in city center like Carmen, who is here today, or in the peripheral area where the homeless workers movements is more active, the occupations have been increasing. There is a lack of alternative because the social function of property has not been fulfilled. Huge buildings, not only buildings, but also empty land, abandoned with tax debt, they just remain there. Also increasing prices in housing. This panel, this discussion is an opportunity for us to reaffirm that occupations, we can see them on the internet, on the news, in books. We have a scene, an image of thousands of people. So we think it may simply be with a lack of homes, but there's also an area of resistance and solidarity networks. There is a great community sense that has been lost in capitalist metropolis. The rooting of people, a collective way of life, not simply the extreme individualist attitude in recent years. Cooperation works, networks of mutual support and solidarity. All of this also has an impact in another topic chosen for this panel today, which is the way of building community housing. Frequently, social movement fights and struggle is split so that the empty buildings become available for housing. The movement has developed technologies also through cooperation, through decades of experience involving people like Nabil, who worked in the municipality with Luisa Irundina, who reigned in 1893, and he has a wonderful experience of mutual aid building along with the social movements. The social movements have developed this forms of mutual aid building, and they have achieved the development of such mutual aid housing to offer better quality housing than the houses that were being built by the major construction companies. The largest apartment of the Minha Casa Minha Vida, My House My Life program, which built for 4 million and so homes. The largest house was actually built in partnership with the housing movement. The big builders would do flats with a size of 40 square meters, whereas those built with movements in partnership were as large as 60 square meters. In Sao Paulo, there's a big speculation of the housing market, so the best developments were done in partnership with movements. Social movements are not simply a form of organizing the lack of housing. They're not simply a way of achieving a material achievement that the state is not able to provide.
Durante o neoliberalismo no norte global, com o fim dos parques públicos de habitação.
The end of the parks, housing parks. The social movements also represent spaces of cooperation, spaces of solidarity, of social encounters, and from that base, the development of technologies of construction that are very often more efficient and cheaper and better quality than ones developed by the big construction companies, because they are involved with those who are the beneficiaries, those who are the needed, the ones who need the homes and who give their labor and their participation. This participation is fundamental. So I'll stop here and leave this as the initial thought for development and raising this initiative and connecting the Brazilian experience of fighting and also participating in developing housing and of cooperation internationally and nationally. Thank you, Guilherme, for this passionate opening about the reality that is being lived in São Paulo. I would like to pass on to Carmen, leader of one of the movements mentioned by Guilherme, and a key actor in a film that I recommended all those here today to watch. It was about the occupation of Cambridge, former Cambridge Hotel. It was Cambridge Hotel. Carmen, the floor is yours. Good morning to all. I would like to greet Guilherme Boulos, Nabil, Luciana, and thank Nuno for the opportunity to be here today, giving voice to our group, to share a problem that the whole world has, but that Brazil seems to be increasing in the, particularly with the pandemic. So the lack of dignified homing. I'm an activist since the 1990s when I arrived in Sao Paulo. I came from Bahia. I had to escape not to be killed by a feminicide, which is an aggravating problem in Brazil and in the world, the plight of women. I slept on the streets, went to a hostel, and there I met the movement, the housing movement. As Guilherme says, social movements, their job is not simply to find homes, it's also to socialize people. There's a social work there, helping people who are vulnerable. Social movements have the opportunity to help them. Today, I'm the leader of a movement which manages 5 occupations in the central area of São Paulo. More recently, another occupation in the periphery, in the south, occupation of land. We have some retrofits, some refits of buildings. One was the old Cambridge Hotel, which is now a social home for 121 families. So it was co-managed recovery of the building was co-managed with the social movement. This highlights that wherever the movement is active, the result is a dignified home with quality. At present, we have a project that highlights the community management, a shared management with social dimension. We involve technical expertise. We have to highlight also the social and legal expertise. The legal element is represented by Dr. Luciana Hideshi. And these activities affect various aspects. It changes how it affects the human being. It changes people's lives. So we are concerned with preparing people to exercise their citizenship. I'll try to avoid repetitive, but São Paulo has a difficulty in addressing, in providing homes for people with low incomes. It has a high price of and power. So the social movements have the capacity to highlight that there is a need, that we have thousands of families in very expensive rentals, and many families, thousands of families living on the streets. We have inappropriate housing. So there's a lot of people cohabiting. So it's a mask of housing. And also there's cortiços, the slum tenements, with 120,000 precarious homes. If we look at the census of 2010, 280,000 buildings empty without any social building, whereas there is almost 400,000 people needing homes. I'm talking about only the São Paulo city. If, like Guilherme said, if you walk in the streets of São Paulo, in the city center, we see massive camping sites with people living on the streets and isolated. In a restrictive isolation created by the municipality of Sao Paulo. People are treated like animals without any dignity. We have no effective program that will provide a home for those families. And through homes, other rights they are entitled to, like health, education, culture, and social movements are providing that. And we do that without being part of the state. We believe we are part of the state, but we believe our state is negligent. That does not provide policies, public policies for its inhabitants. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Carmen. The occupation phenomenon, the organized occupation phenomenon, is something we will discuss again at the end of the debate. I can see some questions on the chat, but I would appeal to participants to be a bit patient and allow speakers to address the audience. And if there's a bit of time in the first part, we can still try to address some of the questions that are being asked via chat. Nabil, the floor is yours. Good morning to all. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to thank the invitation. We've had a few chats before. I'd like to say hello to Carmen, Guilherme, Luciana, who are companions of many years of struggle for the right of city and the right of housing, right to housing. I will split my speech with two moments, two aspects. One, our route, the route for fight for housing in Brazil, and also a little bit to talk about the future. Because we studied the history, we participate in the history, but our eyes are facing the future of our country. I started my activity at the end of the 1970s, an activity that has always been intercalated between academic research about the city, about housing, and intervention. First, supporting social movements at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, when we lived a struggle against the military dictatorship, and the urban social movements had a key role with support of the progressive church and connect with members of the public and develop and address the exclusion of the working population and the poor population of Brazil during the military dictatorship. At the time, we studied the ways in which the difficulties that people faced, particularly if we looked at the allotments in the periphery of Sao Paulo and the self-built mutual aid construction. That's how people ended up solving the housing problem. People solve this by buying plots in speculative market and then building gradually with the help of friends, family, and with some remunerated work. So studying that reality at the time was very important, so that in the early 80s, we could, working along the social movements that were starting to develop greatly in São Paulo and in the whole of Brazil, with support of progressive church elements and a fight for housing. It was a period of economic crisis in Brazil, and we implemented and brought the idea of self-management as a solution for housing for low-income families. That came as through observing how poor people solve their own problems. But instead of an individualized activity, family by family, is to work together with the whole families through self-management programs, through mutirão or mutual aid. And so during the 1980s, a proposal was developed to create mutirão, so mutual aid construction. This was also supported by the Uruguayan cooperatives and from cooperatives in Spain and Sweden. And we also developed the housing policy through using the self-management experiences. This developed as a pilot during the Luiz Erundina municipality government in 1989 and 93, and we put this into practice through a progressive, with support of a progressive municipal leadership. So several programs were developed of mutirão and mutual aid. So about 12,000 communities. and similar other things, similar to the fight of Carmen Seal. At the time, people didn't actually talk about social housing in the city center. That was usually pushed to the periphery. So we started the program of mutual aid in the city center. But unfortunately, in subsequent governments, those initiatives were stopped. We also started an urbanization and regularization of land in the favelas, so in the irregular settlements, and also work that links with what Luciana is doing today, which is juridical support, legal support to people, and the development of a public defense department. So this is the past experience, and I refer it because it's a key reference for the development of production through self-management that I have been discussing with Nuno. And secondly, because in a way that proposal has opened a range of opportunities that over almost 30 years have guided the development of housing policies. From those initiatives, the whole interventions in occupied territories in order to try and regularize the situation, to guarantee urbanization, to guarantee the right to the city in those areas. Also from there came the idea that we have to develop housing in areas where jobs are concentrated. The housing problem cannot also be separated from the transport development. Between 2001 and 14, that was the link to create the zones, special zones of social interest were created then, where we should create housing for low income populations. And that's where we also need to look at a range of solutions, not just a unique program, because Brazil is very different. And so Brazilian cities need different programs, different solutions. That background will end up leading to the My House, My Life program, which was good in many aspects, but also developed some wrong aspects. One of the problems of that program was the way it ended up being disassembled, the proposal that had been put forward in the government program by President Lula before the presidency, that developed the idea of creating the Ministry of Cities to develop different aspects. Unfortunately, owing to the political negotiations that were necessary, the initial proposal of Ministry of Cities had to be dismantled, and those policies became fragmented. So we no longer had such a global proposal for Brazilian cities, but separate programs. Some of them are very good aspects, like House My Life program is the program that developed housing for people with up to 3 minimum salaries. There's a mobility program to ensure transport the bus corridor, bus lanes to develop. So a wide program for transport, but all of those programs, the housing and transport, were developed individually rather than together. So I'm hoping that after the disaster of the last 6 years and the current Brazilian government, we are still in time to rebuild the policies in Brazil and create a new cycle of rethinking the city and to put into practice new programs. A great challenge in this new cycle is to try and work in a more integrated form in the urban development, to think the city not as an adding up of policies in different sectors like sanitation, transport, housing, but in a more integrated way, to integrate all interventions across the territory. We have 7 million in deficit, as Guilherme mentioned. So we have to recover the situation of cohabitation. And a lot of people spend most of their salaries into rental. So we also have the challenges across the peripheries in the city. The periphery is being built by a population ended up creating irregular settlements and precarious settlements. So all of that needs to be integrated. Sanitation, transport, housing, all these policies need to be integrated. So we have to reconstruct the urban development of the city in order to intervene in the cities in a way to transform Brazilian cities into dignified places to live. We also have the need to address the future demand. We talked about the accumulated deficit of housing, the 7 million, but those are families that are already living there in a precarious way. But we have 15 million families that are going to be created in the next 20 years. So looking forward, we have quite a big challenge of developing the 7 million deficit already and the future 15 million that are going to be needed. So we have to articulate the unused area of the city, the unused areas of the cities, and the expansion of new areas in order to deal with that this difficult housing deficit that exists in our country. But Brazil is not alone, but Brazil can become a reference for other countries. Self-management program is definitely one solution, a key solution, not the only solution, but key, because through that program you can articulate a healthy development of coordination and also with political organization. And without political organization, you cannot develop sustainable programs. Very interesting, quite a lot of aspects to debate on. But now we give the floor to Luciana, who will complement with her perhaps more legal view, which is key in these areas. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am a lawyer. I'm active in the city center of São Paulo professionally. To start, I will look at a contradiction. In a way differently from Carmen and Nabil, I may be one step behind the political proposal. Although I participate, I am behind that aspect. I'm dealing with trying to prevent people from being evicted. At the same time that we have laws, advanced laws, starting with the Constitution, the Statute of the City, the Self-Management Law, the Arts Law, 2008, we have a context of evictions. During the pandemic, at least 30,000 people in Brazil were evicted from their homes. And today, more than 135,000 people are facing eviction. So we are talking about policy of occupations in the central areas and also the mutual aid in the periphery and the occupations in the periphery. We are also discussing solidarity, capacitation, and all the work of the social movement. And we are also talking about a very important resistance movement. We need to think of preventing eviction and while thinking of the policies at the same time. This has been a big challenge. The challenge in maintaining the social housing. In São Paulo, there are several proposals going through the municipality, creating programs for the city center. And those programs are not clear in terms of the policy, housing policy for the central area, and also the challenge of popular organization, which is a work that the movement and Guilherme, as Guilherme also mentions, a very important work to organize the population, to make population aware. That work is self-managed, is not funded publicly. It is achieved with the courage of people and leaders. So this is a big contradiction. We have legislation, we have popular organization, but don't have state policy that addresses the deficit numbers. During the pandemic, the street population, people, homeless people, increased 30%. I looked at the data. At the end of 2021, 32,000 people living in the streets in the city of São Paulo, the last census. So right here we have serious contrast. So having pointed that, I would like to talk about the organization of the center, city center, where I also am placed professionally as a lawyer, and where I start my work to defend and to organize together with movement leaders. Forum Centro Vivo, Living Center, which started in 2003. In 2006, it published a report available on the Centro Vivo network, and the forum already points out 5 organized occupations and points to alternatives of making of providing residence to the population. So in between those political proposals, technical expertise is already there, self-management construction is already there. And at that time, the occupation 9 Julho, and also occupation Prestes Maia, and another occupation, Prestes Maia, that involves 400 families, hundreds of people. Those people organize themselves with very little resources. So if it is possible to organize housing with such little infrastructure, just with such little resources, just with solidarity, how come it's not possible to develop a housing policy to help that population? How can the movement, without any resources, without any essential services, the movement can organize that population, organize those spaces, occupied spaces. And they have the proof. These organized occupations existed for over 10 years, some cases longer, and they're trying to regularize the minimum possible, which is the services for electrical and water supply. So the forum published that file, that report, and then we have the movement, work with the movement, trying to participate in all possible forum discussion in order to develop public policies. So then we had My House, My Life program came up, which also involved the land regularization. So until then, there was only an approval law, only one element. One means of regularization. So when My House, My Life was launched in 2009, we have then housing production and regularization of land with resources and the possibility of regularizing land of irregular allotments, regular plots, occupations, and also regular settlements, favelas.
Por falta de vontade política também, então cito aí mais uma contradição, né? De termos uma legislação bastante avançada e que dá
conta. So we have a very advanced legislation, but we don't have a program, a state program, a public policy that will address, or at least not allow the problem to increase. We're talking about policy and legislation that have been created over the last 20 years, but they haven't been able to address, to at least create a balance, to balance the problem, stabilize the problem. So the occupations are increasing. Threats of eviction is increasing. The slum tenements, cortices number is increasing. I don't have an up-to-date number because the housing department in São Paulo is developing a census of cortiços with great difficulty. how would you typify cortiço, a slum tenement?
E o cortiço não foi erradicado.
Cortiços have not been eradicated. They have become strong as a housing policy to lower rent. And numbers will show that the number of cortiços or slum tenements have increased. So this is again a contradiction. We have the laws, but we don't have a program that will overcome, go through the various governments and address, at least to stop the program, stopping the problem to develop. I would like to end my intervention and obviously continue discussion, but from 2017, with the experience of working with the Cambridge occupation and possible experience for the city center, myself, Carmen, the technical support team, FIO. Working together, we joined together experiences and we developed a proposal of partnership. We haven't been able to make it the norm. That program has an element of popular organization, very important element, using the experience of movements in popular organization, looking at the examples, the occupations like Prestes de Maio, Nova de Julho, and other occupations, San Francisco occupation, Mauá occupation. There are lots of examples showing that it is possible. It is to organize housing in buildings in São Paulo, but on the other hand, needs to be supported by policies that allow provisional connections of legal connections of electrical and water supply. We have law that allow that to happen, but we cannot make that effective because it's still reserved as a criminal act. So they seem to prefer to criminalize those who look at obtaining illegal supply of electricity instead of trying to use the law to make it legal to have a provisional supply and decriminalize. So that would help those residents who are provisionally in occupations. I hope my message was clear, but basically summing up, we have history, we have legislation, we have policies, but there isn't a heterogeneous policy that will address the issue with evictions we are facing today. We are almost finishing this first part. We will not be able to address the questions as we run a lot of time. But I would like perhaps to finish with Carmen's voice. As Nabil mentioned, self-management is a key question for us academic researchers. Self-management, as we know, democratic decision is very difficult. To produce work without the formal hand of authority is a challenge, but at the same time, as your interventions have shown, when we can find ways of channel the collective cooperation, we managed to help to get people to cooperate in ways that sometimes more traditional organizations cannot achieve. So what you are doing through self-management is important for the whole world, because these days, with people working remotely, with the technological development, with the millennials who workers who want more autonomous forms of working, they want forms of organizing that are not subjugated to a formal authority. So perhaps Carmen could share the secret of her leadership. I don't have any secret as such. Myself, as thousands of Brazilian women, I'm a mother of a large family, joined the movement by necessity. Obviously, the state is not helping citizens. I have to leave my state, live on the streets. I felt like a refugee in my own country. And then when I joined the housing movement, I realized that those who were next to me had similar problems, some of them even bigger problems. And so I had to fight. And it is in that fight that I become a leader of a housing movement. So I started listening to others, I started fighting. I realized that wherever I was, I would feel just as much as a refugee. So the lack of rights is a lack in the policy. So when I entered the movement, I also started to fight. Why should we have to live in places so far away from our place of work? I had to take three different means of transport, or so by the time I got home, I was exhausted. So as you know, women have two jobs during the day, work and whatever they're engaged in, and then there's the housework, and then there's this elitist way. No boss will employ people who have to travel from so far away. At the same time, Carmen, you say our order is the disorder in the system. When movements become organized, and apart from occupying, they point out the deficiency in those policies. We have documentation, we have internal regulations, we have official registrations, CMPJ. In order for us to be involved in any housing program, is like you're a company. Even if it is a not-for-profit, you have to have a whole range of documentation that is demanded. So apart from dealing with the documentation of the actual entity, you also need to ensure that all the families have all the necessary documentation. So all the organized movements participate in discussions, public audiences, and so they become aware and they learn about the legalities. People the state tends to criminalize it, but if you look at it, we are far more organized than the state itself. And it is from that point that we say that we look at the disorder of the state. They don't expect us to be able to participate in the management. In fact, they don't expect us to be able to manage 20 million worth construction work. So they don't expect us to be able to present reports to the ministries, to the justice. So we also have a way of organizing people to ensure that all our occupations are worked, involved with social security, with legals, with psychologists, with the teaching support. We usually say that our children do not starve. Their cheeks are rosy, they can eat all 3 meals in the day.
Tá bom, Carol. Então, com estas palavras, e agora propor uma pequena pausa para que nos vai dar a oportunidade também para refletir um bocadinho e encontramos-nos daqui a 10 minutos, às 2h15, hora do UK, para a segunda parte do painel. Então até já.
We'll break now for 10 minutes or so and then resume.
So I'm now moving to the English room, and hopefully this break helped Christina to have a pause on her brain. Thanks very much, Christina. I'm sure you are doing an excellent job, and this is not easy when it's just one person doing this in real time. So thanks very much, and hope you had a bit of a rest. For the sake of time, I'm going to be very brief, introducing the speakers, and by all means, the audience then can Google, feel free to Google the names of our panelists, so that way we save a bit of time to move into what matters. So we have actually not two, but three distinguished panelists. Fanish Puranam, Professor of Strategy and Organizational Design at INSEAD. Anita McCann, Professor of Strategic Management at the Rotman School of Management, and also Professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So I know them quite well for the last years, and so thanks very much for accepting this invitation. And I invited you for different reasons, because I know your perspectives complement each other. Then, as Christina and I were started to do this research, we kind of came across this very beautiful paper by Philippe Massa, and we thought, well, let's parachute Philippe into the panel, because he understands both a lot of the theory and also the context, and it also happens that he understands Portuguese. So it's one of those situations that it doesn't make sense to leave them out. And thanks very much to Philippe for arranging your diary so you could attend the event today and be with us. So and then in addition to that, we have Ana Paula Walker, also from Brazil. And Ana Paula is not in a management school. Actually is an anthropologist by training, but again, has an extensive knowledge of the subject matter, and is also has a very interesting role in the co-production of policy to try to influence public policy in Brazil one day. So in that sense, so it's kind of bridges between two worlds, the world of practice and policy and the world of academia. And so it has been a fortune to come across Ana Walker, who I was introduced to by one of the leaders of the movements that we've just heard from. So what I suggest is perhaps we can start with Fanish, and then Anita, and then Ana Paula, and then finally Philippe, because he's new to the setting, and get some of your reactions in real time to what you've just heard, and see how we can collectively leverage the knowledge and the extraordinary access that we have to this setting to produce knowledge that ultimately helps society move in the right direction. So Fanish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nuno. It's a great honor to be invited to participate in this panel. I've been listening very carefully to the first half, and it's been very educative and also kind of humbling, in the sense the sort of problems that you are dealing with here are really important and urgent ones. And I don't think anything I do can be described by those two adjectives. So it's kind of a good calibration to realize that the kind of things we work on in management schools probably don't have the sense of urgency and this flavor of importance that the issues that were described in the first part of the panel had those characteristics. Now, just a little bit about myself and why I find this topic interesting in particular. So I study how organizations work and how we can make them work better. And in particular, I'm very interested in alternatives to hierarchy. So how do we organize large social systems, organizations, if you like, without recourse to multiple layers of authority structures of hierarchy? And this is a topic that perhaps some of you may find quite interesting to know is very hot in the corporate world. So if you look at a lot of the current buzzwords in management, things like agile teams or flat structures or holacracies or glass organizations, or even distributed autonomous organizations, which is where blockchain comes in. At the core of them, they are really attempts to try and organize large numbers of people for collective action without hierarchical structures. And since that was my topic of interest, I've made it a practice over the last 5 years to look for unusual examples of non-hierarchical organizing wherever I can find them. And one of the things I did find was actually this very interesting book on participative budgeting in Brazil. And I got quite interested in how these systems work. And then more recently, Nuno pointed me to some excellent papers by Ana Paula, which I've also studied very carefully. And this has been very instructive for me to understand how these systems actually work. Now, from the perspective that I bring to studying these systems, we know that one of the functional reasons for hierarchy to emerge in the first place is that consensus is very hard to scale. If people could agree peer-to-peer in very large numbers, we would see very little justification for any kind of authority structures, right? Which means that there are really only two large classes of solutions to how to organize large systems without explicit multi-layered hierarchies. One of them is to try and reduce the need for any kind of authority structure whatsoever. And that can happen either by creating very homogeneous cultures. So in these self-management based housing societies that I've been reading about and I've been hearing about, that's clearly playing a role. There is a high degree of homogeneity in the kind of people who are participating here. There is heterogeneity within that. But compared to the general populace or compared to the kind of people you might see in the workforce of a corporate entity, the homogeneity is significantly higher. And that, of course, makes the emergence of norms and consensus relatively easier. This would be my guess, right? I don't know. I'm not an expert on the context at all. The other alternative, which I think is perhaps the one that I find more interesting, is that leaders still emerge in these systems, right? And we've just met one and heard an impassioned speech from her. So leaders still emerge in these systems. But how do these systems generate leaders without descending into tyranny, without becoming hierarchies? That I find to be a really fascinating question. So clearly for social systems, we do need leaders to produce convergence, inspiration, motivation, mobilize, coordination, all the stuff management theorists know about. But the real challenge, I think, is to how to prevent such systems then becoming captured by these systems to become ossified into power structures. If we could understand how this has been accomplished so well in these self-managed housing societies, I think there is a lot we could take from here and learn and scale up to other contexts. So personally, for me, this is the thing that I'm really very keen to learn more about. In particular, as I was reading about these self-managing housing societies, I was quite curious about the role of the commissions, the ones where citizens kind of come together and participate on their own. And effectively, they're not just turnkey contracting, right? They're building stuff. So how does skill-based task allocation occur? What happens to economies of specialization? What happens to the fact that coordination might be challenging because of the specialization? These are really fascinating questions, which if you knew the answer to, right, from this context, I think a lot of that could be broadly relevant, not just in the corporate sector, but also in NGOs more generally, in international organizations and so on. So that's what I'm really hoping to learn from these interactions. And I'm very happy to, in the Q&A, see if I can offer a little bit by way of answer about what we know about these questions from for-profit organizations, which we have studied extensively. But the context you're describing is really so new and fascinating for me. I don't feel particularly qualified to offer any suggestions or answers here. What I bring to the table here really is questions. And these are the questions I would love to have more concrete answers to in our discussion. So how do these systems really solve the problem of specialization, right? Because essentially citizens are jumping in to do tasks that normally specialists do. And how do they manage to balance the twin forces of leadership, right? And at the same time, the forces that push against tyranny and too much centralization. So striking that balance, I think if you knew how to do it, it would be very generally useful information. Let me stop there, and I'd love to hear what others have to say. Thanks again, Nuno. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanish. And without further ado, I'll just move to Anita, so we may find some time in the end to have some discussions.
Thank you very much. Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you. A true honor. And I wish you all a very good morning. And thank you so much for your insights today, as well as for your compelling and important and inspiring work, which is of great importance. I believe that Nuno may have invited me to this panel, not only because of perhaps his familiarity with my scholarship, which I appreciate and value very much, Nuno, thank you, but also because I was a few years ago, president of the Academy of Management, which is the group of the 20,000 business school professors around the world that we all are a part of, Phoenicia and I and Nuno are a part of, and others as well, and where we develop our theories and our thinking about how organizations work and why they work and so on. In that role, I was, I think, quite critical of our field of strategic management, in particular of developing a kind of industrial era approach to organizing that reflected that perhaps didn't consider the depth of certain the histories that led to the kinds of problems that you've described, the 7 million people needing housing in Brazil, the escalation and amplification of these problems, the complexity that Luciana described, for example, of the criminalization of access to electricity, the lived experience that Carmen so creatively described, and Nabil, this long history you have of driving for mutual aid and for developing a kind of integrated approach. That context and especially the vulnerabilities of the poor, the people who are disenfranchised, people who don't have access to the system in a fulsome sense, the ways in which our industrial structures amplify problems, deepen inequities, and constitute barriers to solutions to important problems. I suspect that may have been why Nuno might have invited me and my voice to this conversation. I think we have, in the field of management and organizations, much more to learn from you than we have to offer in terms of insights about organizations. And some areas where I think we can potentially engage most importantly is to really think about this paradox of the commonalities of the problems of that vulnerable people without secure housing, without adequate housing face, around electricity, around transportation, around access to centrally located housing that provides connections to job opportunities, issues having to do with documentation and childhood education so that a mother such as Carmen can get to work. All of that is important. But for me, where we really have a lot to learn is what the broad experience of solidarity and community can deliver in terms of the actualization of human potential. In other words, what is happening in the experience of people when they encounter leaders such as you, in terms of their human actualization through that experience of solidarity? We do not understand, I would put forward, in the field of management and organizations, that that character, that quality of what true experience of solidarity and community can deliver in terms of shared outcomes. So let me stop there and turn it back to Nuno for further development. Thank you.
Okay, Anna, you have first knowledge in firsthand of the setting, so perhaps actually you are in a good position to pick up where Anita left. You are muted. Okay.
Muito obrigada, Nuno, Cris, o Instituto. É prazer e uma honra estar aqui com a Carmen Silva.
Are you in which room are you in?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, just to make sure that Cristina will translate to English.
Yeah, it is an honor to be here. I'm not going to miss the opportunity to speak in
Cristina,
Portuguese.
estás no... ok, yeah.
Obrigada. Bom, é um prazer e uma honra estar aqui com a professora Luciana, com
It is an honor to be here with Luciana, Nabil, Carmen, and Guilherme, people whom I admire and for whom I have a lot of respect. And I have very little to add to such achievements in terms of housing and the right to the city. I would like to reiterate what Guilherme Boulos mentioned about the housing crisis. Unfortunately, the number of occupations has increased a lot in São Paulo. We walked the city in one weekend, the next weekend there's others occupations, which reflects the lack of ability of people to pay rent. Even in a consolidated favela, consolidated settlement, a lot of families cannot afford to pay the rents. So the situation is very critical. And as Guilherme says, lack of public policies and the interruption of policies in various governments, and been working with occupations, young occupations. So everything was agreed to buy, and then families were waiting for the money, and then at the end, the money was not released. So it is a political crime against all these families. A lot of families who have their self-management projects approved, and the money is not released, so they're just waiting for better days. And the question raised by Nabil for the need of coordinated policies. Not even movements say that everything needs to be self-management, but complementing programs, different solutions, as Nabil said. So with urbanization and resources, so multimodal perspectives are definitely a solution, both for Brazil, for South Africa, also for the United States. A policy that appreciates the diversity of housing needs of low-income families. As to policy, public policy and occupations, we can see solidarity comes from the heart and comes from voluntary work by technical experts, housing movements, and they do not leave communities in the lurch. There's Occupation Anchieta, a community I work with. There is a self-urbanization process with very little resource from government. Developments are very slow, but the social movement and expert support are progressing it as far as they can. What I have to say about self-management process, and also with Usina, one of the expert teams, support teams, in my modest opinion, a solution does not involve the housing sector. The housing movement, the technical support teams, they are far more able and better positioned to develop solutions for housing for low-income families rather than the real estate market. In fact, the real estate market undoes the work that has been achieved by the social movements and their support of the technical expertise teams. Even communities that are entitled, they become part of new projects. So people who live in a community that has achieved urbanization, has been able to register the land, feels threatened by the real estate developers. Unfortunately, is a challenge they face. So those people develop the infrastructure, and then once the infrastructure has been developed, then the real estate markets come and destabilizes it again. I have the opportunity to see the Dandara building and the documentation by Carmen, and so it's beautiful to see the occupations you organize, the issues that Carmen mentioned about the support to women, the solidarity to women, and the network of support that the movement provides to families who are in the self-management projects, and how they work through committees to address issues for children, issues for the elderly. By observing that, we can see how women who participate in that process become professionalized, develop, some of them go to university, and they can develop, and so they benefit from a very important support network from within the movement, particularly issues that affect women. I don't think I have anything else to add. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Anna Walker, for your intervention. It reminded me that once I interviewed a leader of a movement, and when he was talking about participation in committees, he joked that I must think that all my families are people are women widows or yet to marry, because I never see the man on the committees, which is quite an interesting observation. Philippe has been parachuted, but you understand very well processes of organizing without authority. So I thought you may have something you want to chip in.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you, everybody. This has been pretty wonderful for me. I think a privilege to hear, people in my hometown of Sao Paulo talking about the topic I research every day, which is, to me, the intersection of those two is just fabulous to be a part of. So thank you, Nuno, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughts and for your work. I think, I often think about how the failures of a state lead to institutional work on the part of people on the ground, right? Real people doing work that seems small to them, but is institutional and large and an important force for change elsewhere and even in their own context. I grew up in Sao Paulo, and I find the work of desanctifying private property in Sao Paulo, of making it not the top priority, a core of the system, but something that can be challenged and can be worked around and can be flexible, to be very important. And also the legitimation of alternative living arrangements that are not necessarily known to people, to people in terms of how to do it, when to do it, how to bring together people in a way that makes it so this collective remains cohesive over time. So in my own research, I tend to study online communities and how they come together and remain together over time. despite oppression, despite issues with organizing. What I find interesting here, and I'll echo Fanisha a little bit in this, is that this organization, if you want to call it that, this movement, has been able to do incredible work, specializing and being able to accomplish tasks efficiently without clear, hierarchical leadership, but also very importantly, they've been able to do it under serious oppression from the government, right? So we talk a lot about organizing for inclusion, organizing so that there can be productivity and specialization. We rarely talk about organizing for resilience against oppression, which I think is a very important topic, given what we see in Ukraine, what we see in Hong Kong, right? People organizing groups to accomplish various social goods without being destroyed by their own government or their own inability to remain coherent and cohesive over time. So that's what interests me. It's participation architecture, not just architecture in terms of housing, right? But creating a participation architecture that is resilient to all of these forces that the typical corporate organizations that we deal with in our jobs every day don't deal with. So to me, and again, bringing what Fanish said, what's interesting in studying these organizations, these groups generally, is how they do these things in contexts that to other kinds of organizations would seem extreme and would appear to be very difficult. So I really want to celebrate the work that's being done here as something that is more challenging than typical organizing, is something that is more difficult for not just the fact that it is self-organized, but the fact that it is self-organized under particular constraints that are not usual. And to me, that is where the innovations in organizing become important, and where I think we as management scholars, as organizational designers, as social movement scholars can contribute. It's in understanding how these different contextual forces shape and are adapted to by these, I'll call them entrepreneurs, right? People like Carmen, who are doing the work on the ground every day, trying to kludge together solutions to these problems that eventually shape an organization that somehow functions, not because they've learned this model at school, but because they learned it on the ground. So thank you for the opportunity. Like everybody else, I have more questions than answers, and I have, great hope that, my hometown becomes a better place because of your work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. What I'll suggest is, because we have a bit of time, but before we go into a second round, I would go back to Carmen. And Carmen, you have been listening to us. And so actually, perhaps I'll move to the Portuguese room, if you do not mind. Carmen, tem estado a ouvir com muito interesse
Carmen, you have been listening to with lots of interest, and all of us are fascinated with your work. And as a leader of a movement that has the task of organize and mobilize human resources, but at the same time, the people you mobilize, they are not your employees. You have no formal authority over them. And like Fanish has articulated, there is always a tension. On one hand, you don't become into tyranny, but on the other hand, you have to motivate people to work together. You have to construct order without authority to give the orders. In a context like the one Philippe has articulated, an aggressive context. Obviously, your context is not always aggressive. There have been progressive government leaders, but there's an oscillation. So how do you manage this ballet dance of being able to construct order without having the authority to give orders? I'm laughing because it is a contrast, but at the same time, people need guidance. The role of leadership, sometimes you have to be aggressive, other times you have to be understanding. But you have overall to have a capacity to understand and to listen. And also to be able to flexibilize things, but not forgetting to ensure order. You have to always be developing, training. There is an exchange of knowledge. When we work along other sectors, which is outside the housing, you also learn through exchange. The movement MSPC has always aimed to ensure that other people can go through a process of leadership, of liberating. We have conflict mediators. Sorry, we have mediators within the occupations. We have the overall leadership. So obviously we do the advocacy, strategically planning with other bodies, with the municipality, with the state, with other sectors. But within the movement, within the occupation, there are other people who exercise leadership. And we find that out every day. But yes, it is very difficult, there's no doubt. They are not my employees, not formal. There is a cause behind it. And the cause is the search for improvement of the quality of living. So that is what involves us. Thank you, Carmen. So perhaps now we have 15 minutes before perhaps Fanish could offer a few more reflections based on these comments by Carmen.
To be honest, again, I have more questions than reflections. I would like to know, like, firstly, how many more Carmens are there in the movement, right? This is like the first question that comes to my mind. And then I would like to know, like, how does Carmen groom the next generation of leaders? So who are the next rung who will step up at some point to support her and maybe do what she's doing today? And what are the processes that produce these next generation of leaders? That's my question.
Okay. So let's just go around and then we'll finish with Carmen. Anita?
Thank you. This is just a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to all of you. I guess what I'm interested in is what we kind of in a nerdy way would call in our field the dependent variables or the outcomes that are arising here. And of course, there are many critical outcomes. I can't wait to read Felipe's and Ana Paula's papers, critical outcomes around housing security and employment and so on. But there are also, it seems to me, other types of outcomes relating to feelings of inclusion, of dignity, of security. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit about their importance, please.
Anna, you are in a good position because you do a lot of research on these settings and on your work with these recent favela. So would you want perhaps to address this question on outcomes and feelings of inclusion and dignity and the way in which they emerge?
somente para repetir, a pergunta foi sobre...
Just to repeat, the idea is feelings of inclusion through the movement.
Você poderia repetir a pergunta?
Can you repeat the question?
Eu não... sim, eu falo de uma posição de quem é uma...
I speak from an academic, speaking from outside of Brazil. But I believe the feeling of inclusion has to come with inclusion itself.
Ou seja, a gente... Eu acho que o movimento trabalha, claro, com...
I think the movement works with a feeling of solidarity, a feeling of cooperation to achieve the rights and to develop the urban policies of the city, in particular relating to the dignified housing, basic sanitation. But that inclusion feeling, it's not enough for it to just be a feeling of inclusion. It has to come with inclusion itself. The movement never allows the loss of that perspective, which is to obtain urbanized land for its workers. That is the function of the state, to provide that land. I'm not sure if I answered the question properly. From my perspective, the movement tries to establish that harmony between self-management without forgetting government's function to promote public policies. And can you observe, can you see that feeling, the development of the feeling of dignity and of inclusion itself? Do you have any indicators that show that this is happening? The feeling of dignity develops gradually as people adhere to the movement?
Eu acho que a Carmen pode responder isso pouco melhor, mas
I think Carmen could respond that far better than I could. But I think that participation in the housing movement itself is a necessity. And from that necessity, to guarantee a minimum of humanity and dignified treatment for the population, in that sense of solidarity, yes, I believe a feeling of development grows. And social identification with other people who suffer from a similar feeling of exclusion. Where I come from in my own position, the way I believe I relate to social housing is not so much assess their efficiency of their work. My objective is to support the agenda of the social movement, to think the city development alongside the housing movement. So in that sense, I have work with indicators of efficiency of work of the movement. My work is more in partnership, working in partnership, and how to think with the movement. Efficiency questions I identify is what Guilherme identified. The quality of houses social movements achieve is far better. Both in terms of the space provided, the area provided, the houses are bigger, but also the material used for construction of those houses. They have proper walls. If you go sometimes into houses built by the housing market for low income families, and they have small windows, the walls are flimsy. If you go, poor quality, and if you go to the houses built by the governments with these projects, quality is far better. So while those programs evolve, as they evolve, the dialogue between the state and organized civil society, that was a result of things improving in terms of obtaining land in more centralized areas. So it's only in those aspects that I would think in terms of indicators of quality of housing. I hope I've replied. So I will pass to Carmen first before going back to Felipe. Would you like to add anything else? People are intrigued how the feelings of dignity and solidarity emerge. I would like to say something, The movement has a role from the very beginning. When we organize people with so-called, so if you don't have housing, so we are interested in people who don't have homes, people who have no regular place to live, they can't afford housing, so we are interested in making those people aware. So there's a lot of people in Brazil that they get everything free, that the government will give you a home, they'll give you food, they'll give you milk at the nursery. So a lot of people, people are unaware. So we do not deal with assistantialism, as you call, with the state providing things. We try to work people for them to become aware, to ensure that they become part of the state, register the children to school, having all documentation up to date. But like everyone else, families have to follow the laws, and as citizens, it is our obligation to understand the laws. The politician who wins the elections and who does public policies, they do not follow through the promises or follow the law. So we have to ensure that the families understand that without following the law, they cannot achieve. So when it comes to the technical aspect of an occupation, those people who are with us within the occupation, they have already gone through that awareness-based process, that training, if you will. So they need to understand how the movement operates, so they are conscientized, they realize how the movement works. However, we can't forget that we are dealing with people, with human beings, and this is a country of people who go, oh, give me a hand, or oh, we'll wait too, and therefore we need to make sure that we don't buy in. But we can't force people to adhere. So each person will adhere to what they want. For example, the government does not teach people, does not make people aware of how important it is for people to have documents. For example, that's the voter's title. People think it's just to vote. It's more important than that. If they don't register to vote, basically they can be blocked, so they become part of the system. So they can't achieve, they can't access any funding, they can't access any housing program. So we make them aware of that, but it's part of the individual's decision to join that, to make sure they regularize their own situation. So we have to raise awareness about the fact that what people think about the government giving this and that and food and housing is a myth. Thank you, Carmen. We'll leave it at that. We could stay here all day discussing this, but time is running out. So I'll ask Philippe for a last reaction to Carmen's before we close.
Sure. Thank you. Carmen. Thank you. What I notice whenever Carmen speaks is how she balances empathy and an understanding of the structures necessary and what is necessary for her people to work together. And I think whenever I've interviewed leaders of self-organized collectives, it's that balance that I notice. And going back to what Anita said, it's the understanding of both the emotional work that's needed to keep people going and the structures that are necessary to keep people together. And to me, that's what I think I hear in Carmen's voice, is people need to do this. It is their option to do this, but it all comes from a place of love and empathy, which I think is an incredible skill, right? To be able to do this. And to me, that is extremely impressive. And it solves a lot of the puzzles, right? If leadership becomes a balance of empathy and teaching, right? Expanding knowledge to other people in the group so that it's not compartmentalized inside a leader that tells people what to do, all of this becomes easier because you are empowering others and showing them that you care so that they don't go off and do things that you wouldn't want them to do. So that's where I want to end it. I just find this fascinating, and thank you so much for including me.
I've just noticed that reparei que a Luciana tem estado sempre
I
conosco.
noticed that Luciana has been stoically with us, and I would like to give you the last words. Luciana, you have to be extremely generous with your time. Thank you. I'm listening to everyone. And I'm noticing that solidarity is fluid. It appears. You can't start solidarity where there is no possibility for it to exist. So the collective action of Carmen and the movement of bringing the families together and guide them, help them to communicate and access their rights. It's a cement of solidarity. And in that collective, in the collective action in which I participate, sometimes I realize that leadership always means representation, and representation doesn't always mean leadership. Carmen is very often a representative, but not necessarily a leader. So she's listening, she's working with everyone. So she represents the collective. And leadership, the leaders are not always represented. They're there every day. So she's there in the shop of used clothes, in the kitchen. So is Carmen's day-to-day work of proposing to face the problems and to resist to the outside forces. We are all still facing a criminalization process. We all have an aura of criminalization that is facing us on a daily basis. and solidarity
essas ações
is
e aí as pessoas
flows through the
movement
movement and goes through the movement, through everyone.
É tudo enorme processo de
So it is
comunicação.
a huge communication process.
Qual é a receita que funciona?
We're not able to say what is the magic recipe, but what does work is active communication, become aware to policies. Sao Paulo is all very dynamic. And capital doesn't achieve everything sometimes, gives us opportunity for us to have a position. So we have a set of partnerships, open doors, closed doors. So it is through that kind of work, that communication, that solidarity works. So basically the improvement of a collective activity. Nuno is going to remain in the Portuguese room to say goodbye to our guests. I'd like to thank everyone, Carmen, Nabil, Guilherme, and Siana, for their contributions. It's priceless, the time they dedicated to the event to share their knowledge. Also thank Anita, Felipe, Fanish, Ana Paula for making time to be here today. Let's continue the dialogue. Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Cristina.
Obrigada. Thank you.